Hey there, how's it going? Thanks for joining me today. Whether you're relaxing at home, on your commute, or winding down for the evening, I'm really glad you're here. Picture this. It's 7:23 on a Tuesday morning in October. Maria Rodriguez is settling into her shift at John F. Kennedy International Airport, steam rising from her coffee cup as she watches the familiar dance of green dots across her radar screen. She's been doing this job for 15 years, guiding metal birds safely through the sky, and she knows this morning routine like a meditation. Flight 747 from London Heathrow is exactly where it should be, 37 minutes out, descending through 28,000 feet right on schedule. Maria takes a sip of her coffee, glances at the weather report. Clear skies, light winds, perfect flying conditions, and then looks back at her screen. And in that split second, in the time it takes for her brain to process what her eyes are seeing, half the world changes forever. Flight 747 is gone. Not a gradual fade, not a technical glitch where the dot flickers and reappears. Just gone. Along with Delta 812 from Atlanta, and Air France 91 from Paris, and United 317 from Los Angeles. In the span of a single heartbeat, Maria watches 23 aircraft simply vanish from her screen. Now, I know what you're thinking. Equipment failure, right? Some massive technical malfunction. That's exactly what Maria thought too. She's stabbing at her console, calling maintenance, her heart starting to hammer in her chest. But here's the thing that makes her blood run cold. She can see other flights, still cruising along their routes, completely unaffected. The system isn't broken. Those planes are just gone. And it's not just Maria's screen. In control towers from London to Tokyo, from Sao Paulo to Mumbai, air traffic controllers are experiencing the exact same impossible moment. 7,000 aircraft, carrying roughly 1.4 million people, have simply disappeared from radar. No mayday calls, no emergency transmissions, no distress signals cutting through the radio static. Just silence where there should be pilots' voices. But here's where it gets truly terrifying. Those empty blips on the radar, they represent something far worse than vanished passengers. Think about it for a second. Every one of those aircraft still has momentum, still has gravity pulling it earthward, but now there's nobody at the controls. 7,000 metal tubes, each weighing between 50 and 400 tons, are about to become 7,000 unguided missiles dropping from the sky. Maria doesn't know this yet. She's still frantically trying to raise Flight 747 on the radio. But 37 minutes from now, that Boeing 777 is going to plow into a suburb outside Newark at 400 miles per hour. The cockpit is empty. The passengers are gone. There's nothing left but physics and tragedy. Meanwhile, 8,000 miles away in Mumbai, 12-year-old Amit Sharma is running late for school. His mother, Priya, always makes him these incredible breakfast parathas, stuffed with potatoes and spices that make the whole apartment smell like heaven. This morning is no different, except when Amit finally drags himself to the kitchen, rubbing sleep from his eyes, he finds something that will haunt him for the rest of his life. The paratha is sitting on the plate, still warm, with exactly 3 bites taken out of it. His mother's chai glass is half empty, still steaming. Her chair is pushed back from the table, as if she just stepped away for a moment. The newspaper is folded to the crossword puzzle she was working on. 7 across is half filled in, eternal, but Priya Sharma is nowhere to be found. Amit calls for her, searches the apartment, checks the bathroom, the balcony, even looks under the bed, like when he was little and thought monsters might be hiding there. But his mother has simply ceased to exist. Her breakfast cooling on the table, her slippers by the door, her reading glasses on the kitchen counter, everything exactly as it should be, except for the woman who had been sitting there just moments before. And across the globe in Beijing, something equally impossible is unfolding. Picture this. Thousands of autonomous vehicles, those marvels of 21st century technology, continue their programmed routes through the city streets. Their artificial intelligence systems are functioning perfectly, their sensors detecting obstacles, their navigation systems updating in real time. But look inside these cars, and you'll see empty seats where passengers should be, briefcases sitting beside nobody, coffee cups cooling in cup holders, steam still rising, but no hands to hold them. The self-driving cars don't know their passengers have vanished. Their programming doesn't account for this possibility. So they continue driving to offices where empty elevators will arrive at empty floors, to schools where backpacks wait in empty hallways, to homes where pets will scratch at doors that no one will ever open again. This is day zero of what will become known as the vanishing, the morning half the world's population simply stopped existing. Not dead, not transported, not hidden, just gone, as if they had never been born. And in those first few minutes, as the reality of what's happening begins to sink in, the secondary catastrophes start cascading like dominoes falling in slow motion. Because here's what nobody anticipated. Modern civilization isn't designed to lose half its operators instantly. We built a world that requires constant human attention, and we built it so efficiently, so interdependently, that losing even a fraction of our workforce creates chaos. Losing half? That creates something unprecedented in human history. Within the first hour, those 7,000 pilotless aircraft begin falling from the sky. Near Frankfurt, a Lufthansa flight bound for Singapore carves a burning scar across a wheat field. Outside São Paulo, an empty passenger jet plows through a favela, killing 37 people who survived the vanishing only to die from its aftermath. The mathematical precision is horrifying. Every 90 seconds, somewhere on Earth, 300 tons of aluminum and steel slam into the ground at terminal velocity. But the aviation disasters are just the beginning. In operating rooms around the world, surgeons vanish mid-surgery, leaving patients on tables with chest cavities open, hearts exposed, lives hanging by threads that have just been cut. Doctor. Elizabeth Morrison at Johns Hopkins was 3 hours into a complex cardiac procedure when she simply stopped existing. Her patient, a 43-year-old father of two, bleeds out on the table while the remaining surgical team tries desperately to save a life that their colleagues' hands had been holding just moments before. On highways across 6 continents, vehicles suddenly become driverless bullets. The aftermath is immediate and brutal. On Interstate 95 outside Boston, a semi-truck traveling at 75 miles per hour loses its driver and becomes a 30-ton wrecking ball carving through morning traffic. The physics are unforgiving. Momentum doesn't care about human tragedy. In the span of 1 hour, highway accidents kill another 800,000 people who survived the initial vanishing. Think about that for a second. 800,000 human beings who woke up this morning, brushed their teeth, kissed their families goodbye, and had no idea they were living through the last hour of functional civilization. They weren't among the vanished. They were the unlucky ones left behind in a world that was about to forget how to keep them alive. But the mechanical apocalypse is just getting started, because the real terror isn't what breaks immediately. It's what keeps running on autopilot. Systems designed to be safe that become deadly when nobody's watching. In control rooms around the globe, nuclear power plants begin their emergency shutdown sequences. These procedures were hardened after Fukushima, automated to protect against exactly this kind of catastrophe. The computers don't care why the humans are gone. They just know that critical positions are unmanned and safety protocols demand immediate action. Reactor control rods slam into place at 440 nuclear facilities worldwide, shutting down fission reactions that have been burning for decades. Here's the thing about nuclear reactors. They don't just stop being dangerous when you turn them off. Those fuel rods are still incredibly hot, still incredibly radioactive, and they need constant cooling for months, sometimes years, after shutdown. The backup diesel generators kick in automatically, buying time, but diesel tanks don't refill themselves. Emergency cooling systems require human oversight. Warning lights that should trigger immediate human response are blinking in empty control rooms. At the Indian Point Energy Center, 40 miles north of Manhattan, the backup generators have enough fuel for 7 days. 7 days before the spent fuel cooling pools start to boil. 7 days before 20 times more radioactive material than Chernobyl begins to overheat. The automated systems weren't designed for a world without humans. They were designed to keep humans safe until humans could fix the problem. But humans are exactly what the world no longer has enough of. Meanwhile, in server farms from Virginia to Singapore, a different kind of countdown begins. The Internet, that invisible nervous system of modern civilization, starts its death spiral. Data centers consume incredible amounts of electricity, not just to power the servers, but to keep them cool. Server rooms that house our digital lives require temperatures between 68 and 72 degrees Fahrenheit. Without air conditioning, without human technicians monitoring systems, those rooms begin heating up fast. At Facebook's massive data center in Prineville, Oregon, the first temperature alarms trigger at 8:17 a.m. Pacific time. By noon, the server room reaches 100 degrees. By evening, it's 150 degrees Fahrenheit. Hard drives designed to last for years are cooking themselves to death in a matter of hours. 20 years of human memory, photos, videos, messages, the digital archaeology of our lives begins evaporating into heat and electromagnetic silence. Amazon Web Services sends out its last automated status update at 4:32 p.m. Eastern Time. System temperature critical. Initiating emergency protocols. But there's no one left to initiate anything. The cloud, that ethereal-sounding repository of human knowledge, turns out to be very physical after all. And when it burns fast. Across the globe, 600 million pets suddenly find themselves alone. Dogs that have never missed a meal wait by food bowls that will never be filled again. Cats who have known only love and comfort meow at doors that will never open. In apartments from New York to New Delhi, loyal companions begin the slow realization that their humans aren't coming home. But perhaps the most heartbreaking scenes unfold in the countryside, in the massive industrial farms that feed the world. These facilities were marvels of efficiency, housing tens of thousands of animals in carefully controlled environments. Automated feeding systems dispense precise amounts of food at exact intervals. Environmental controls maintain perfect temperatures. It's agricultural engineering at its finest, and it all depends on human oversight. In Iowa, a pork facility housing 40,000 pigs continues its automated routine. Feed dispensers release their scheduled portions. Water systems maintain pressure, but the backup systems that kick in when something goes wrong, those require human intervention. The facility has enough stored feed for exactly 72 hours. After that, automated efficiency becomes automated starvation. The same story repeats across tens of thousands of facilities worldwide. Chickens in massive battery farms, cattle in feedlots, dairy cows in industrial operations, millions of animals trapped in systems designed for efficiency, not survival. The farmers who understood these complex systems, who could troubleshoot problems and adapt to emergencies, have vanished, along with half of humanity. As the sun sets on this first impossible day, the scale of what's happening begins to come into focus. This isn't just a tragedy. It's a complete systems failure of human civilization. Every institution, every service, every carefully maintained piece of infrastructure assumes a certain number of humans will show up to work tomorrow. Traffic control systems, power grids, water treatment facilities, hospitals, police stations, fire departments, they're all running on skeleton crews now, if they're running at all. Maria Rodriguez makes it through her shift, somehow. She guides the remaining aircraft in her sector to safe landings, her voice steady over the radio even as her world collapses around her. When she finally leaves JFK that evening, she looks up at a sky that should be crisscrossed with contrails and sees only empty blue. For the first time in over a century, the skies above New York are silent. But this is just the beginning, because what happens when the lights go out? When the last backup generator runs dry? When the systems we built to protect us start failing without human hands to maintain them? That's what we're going to explore next time, as we dive into the 3 days that changed everything, when the infrastructure that powers civilization finally gives up, and the real fight for survival begins. 3 days, that's how long it took for the lights to go out forever. You know, when we talked about that first impossible day, I mentioned those nuclear power plants automatically shutting down, their backup generators humming reassuringly in the background. Well, here's the thing about backup systems. They're designed to buy you time, not to run indefinitely. And time, as it turns out, is the one thing the post-vanishing world doesn't have. Let me paint you a picture of what's happening at Indian Point Energy Center, just 40 miles north of Manhattan. It's Thursday morning now, 72 hours after the vanishing, and those diesel generators that kicked in automatically on Tuesday, they're starting to cough and sputter like old cars on a cold morning. Each generator burns through about 300 gallons of diesel per hour. The facility has enough stored fuel for exactly 7 days of operation. But here's the kicker. No fuel trucks are coming. The drivers vanished along with half of humanity. At 6:47 a.m., the first generator runs dry. Now, you might think, okay, so one generator fails, but there are backups for the backups, right? And you'd be correct. There are. But remember, this facility was designed with human intervention in mind. When one system fails, humans are supposed to step in, reroute power, balance loads, make the critical decisions that keep everything running smoothly. But the control room that should be buzzing with activity is as silent as a tomb. By noon on Thursday, the last generator at Indian Point shudders to a halt. And that's when the real nightmare begins. See those spent fuel rods I mentioned? They're sitting in cooling pools that contain about 1,500 tons of highly radioactive material. That's 20 times more than what was released at Chernobyl. Without active cooling, the water in those pools starts to heat up, not slowly, not gradually, but with the relentless determination of basic physics. Water boils at 212 degrees Fahrenheit, and once it starts boiling in those pools, you've got about 48 hours before the water level drops low enough to expose the fuel rods to air. Picture this. By Saturday evening, steam starts rising from the spent fuel pools like ghostly fingers reaching toward the sky. The automatic monitoring systems are screaming warnings that no one will ever hear. Temperature sensors hit their maximum readings and stop functioning. Water level indicators drop into the red zone and stay there. And then, on Sunday morning, 1 week after the vanishing, something happens that will change the geography of the Northeast forever. The water in the spent fuel pools evaporates completely. Now, here's what makes this different from Chernobyl or Fukushima. This isn't an explosion. There's no dramatic blast that you could point to and say, that's when it happened. Instead, it's something far more insidious. Exposed to air, those fuel rods start to oxidize and burn. It's not fire as you and I understand it, but a slow, radioactive smoldering that will continue for years. The invisible cloud that begins drifting south toward New York City carries cesium, strontium, and plutonium, elements that will make hundreds of square miles uninhabitable for 3,000 years. Think about that timescale for a moment. 3,000 years ago, ancient Greece was just beginning to emerge from the Bronze Age. That's how long the land around Indian Point will remain poisoned. But the death of the power grid creates cascades that nobody anticipated. In Manhattan, 8.4 million people once relied on a system that delivered 1.3 billion gallons of clean water every single day. That water didn't just appear magically in taps. It required massive pumping stations, water treatment facilities, and complex distribution networks, all of which needed electricity to function. Within 48 hours of the power going out, every toilet in New York City becomes nothing more than an expensive porcelain sculpture. 20 million toilets, to be exact, each one a monument to humanity's hubris. But that's just the beginning of the sanitation nightmare. Without functioning sewage treatment plants, without the pumps that move waste away from populated areas, the city starts drowning in its own filth. Here's what nobody expected, though. The subway system, that marvel of engineering that moved 5.5 million riders daily, becomes the city's salvation in the most unlikely way. You see, the New York subway tunnels were carved out of living rock, but they're not waterproof. They never were. Every single day, 13 million gallons of groundwater seep into those tunnels naturally. For over a century, massive pumps worked around the clock to keep that water out, pumping it up and away, maintaining the dry underground world that millions of commuters took for granted. But when the power dies, those pumps die with it. At first, it's just puddles in the deepest stations. Track workers who remain in the city notice water pooling around the third rail on the Lexington Avenue line. But by the end of the first week, something extraordinary is happening. The tunnels aren't just flooding, they're transforming into underground rivers. Picture this: water flowing through the BMT tunnel under the East River, connecting Brooklyn to Manhattan in ways the engineers never intended. The elaborate network of subway tunnels becomes a circulatory system in reverse, distributing groundwater throughout the city instead of transporting people. Within 6 months, you could paddle a canoe from Times Square to Grand Central, 60 feet underground, following currents that carve new channels through concrete and steel. The irony is beautiful in its way. Manhattan, built on an island, is reclaiming its essential nature, the underground springs that the Lenape Indians knew centuries ago begin flowing again. The subway system, which represented humanity's conquest over nature, becomes the pathway for nature's return. But while New York faces a slow-motion catastrophe, Houston confronts something far more immediate and terrifying: the Ship Channel. That 60-mile corridor of refineries and chemical plants represents one of the most concentrated collections of toxic materials on Earth. We're talking about facilities that process benzene, hydrogen sulfide, chlorine, methyl isocyanate, and dozens of other compounds that can kill you in parts per million. Under normal circumstances, these plants operate with safety margins that would make NASA proud. Multiple redundant systems, highly trained personnel, emergency response protocols. It's industrial safety at its finest. But here's the thing about chemical plants: they're not designed to run themselves. Those safety systems I mentioned, they're calibrated for hours of human absence, maybe a day or two in extreme circumstances. They were never meant to handle weeks of complete abandonment. At the ExxonMobil refinery in Baytown, the first crisis hits on Friday, day 4 after the vanishing. A storage tank containing benzene develops a small leak, the kind of issue that human operators would spot and fix in minutes. But the automated systems don't recognize this particular failure mode. The leak spreads, vapors accumulate, and when a routine electrical spark occurs in a nearby control room, the explosion can be heard 50 miles away. That first blast triggers a domino effect that unfolds over the following weeks. Storage tanks fail, pipelines rupture, chemical reactions that should be carefully controlled spiral into chaos. By the end of the second week, the entire ship channel is burning with a chemical fire that burns every color of the rainbow: toxic blues from copper compounds, brilliant greens from boron, deep purples from potassium. The smoke plume is visible from space, a dark stain spreading southeast toward the Gulf of Mexico. NASA's automated satellites, still functioning despite humanity's absence, capture images that would terrify any environmental scientist. The chemical cloud carries dioxins, heavy metals, and synthetic compounds that have never existed in nature. It creates a dead zone that stretches from Houston to Louisiana, an area where nothing will grow for 500 years. But here's the unexpected twist in this tale of industrial catastrophe. The Houston disaster, as terrible as it is, actually saves countless other areas from similar fates. You see, those burning refineries and chemical plants? They produce the fuel and raw materials that power 10,000 other industrial facilities across North America. When the production stops, when the supply chains snap like overstretched rubber bands, those other facilities simply shut down. It's like pulling the plug on industrial civilization. A steel mill in Gary, Indiana, designed to run continuously for decades, powers down for the first time since 1947 when its feedstock deliveries stop coming. Chemical plants from New Jersey to California trigger their emergency shutdown procedures when critical supplies fail to arrive. The great engine of industrial production, which had been running at full throttle for over a century, suddenly finds itself without fuel. The silence is profound. For the first time since the Industrial Revolution began, the constant background hum of heavy industry fades from the American landscape. No more blast furnaces roaring in Pennsylvania. No more chemical reactors bubbling in Louisiana. No more assembly lines humming in Michigan. The machines that had been humanity's greatest servants stand as silent as monuments. In the suburbs around major cities, a different kind of darkness descends. Not just the absence of electric light, but the darkness of realization. Suburban communities, designed around the assumption of abundant energy and complex supply chains, discover just how fragile their carefully manicured existence really is. Take Westchester County, just north of the city. These communities were masterpieces of modern suburban planning. Houses with perfect lawns, 3-car garages, swimming pools, and central air conditioning. Every home, a little kingdom of comfort and convenience. But comfort and convenience, it turns out, require an enormous amount of infrastructure support. When the power goes out permanently, those homes become uninhabitable faster than anyone imagined. Not because of the lack of lights or television or internet, people can live without those, but because modern suburban homes were designed as sealed environments. They depend entirely on mechanical systems for heating, cooling, and air circulation. Without electricity, they become either ovens or freezers, depending on the season. By the end of the first month, the survivors in Westchester face a choice that their grandparents would have understood, but they never expected to make: abandon the suburbs or freeze to death when winter comes. The lucky ones still have functional fireplaces, though most haven't been used for anything but ambiance in decades. The unlucky ones start burning furniture, then books, then anything that will combust. But it's not just about heat, it's about water. Suburban water pressure depends on electric pumps and complex distribution systems. When those fail, taps run dry within hours. The swimming pools that were symbols of suburban success become the only source of water for drinking, cooking, and washing. Chlorinated water that was never meant for consumption becomes liquid gold. And then there's food. Suburban kitchens, designed around the assumption of abundant electricity, become useless monuments to modern convenience. Electric stoves, microwave ovens, refrigerators, dishwashers, they're all just expensive sculptures now. The suburban garage, which once housed multiple cars, becomes a desperate attempt at food preservation as families try to build root cellars and smoking sheds with no knowledge of how these things actually work. The learning curve is steep and unforgiving. Families who once ordered takeout 3 times a week suddenly need to understand concepts like food preservation, grain storage, and seasonal eating. Many don't make it, not from violence or drama, but from simple ignorance. They eat spoiled food and get sick. They burn green wood and poison themselves with carbon monoxide. They make 1,000 small mistakes that their great-grandparents would have avoided instinctively. Meanwhile, in the control rooms of power plants across the continent, a strange drama plays out with no human audience. Automated systems continue their programmed routines, checking sensors, adjusting parameters, sending reports to computer terminals that no one will ever read. It's like a vast mechanical opera performed for an empty theatre. At the Niagara Power Station, hydroelectric turbines continue spinning, generating electricity that flows into a grid with fewer and fewer consumers each day. The automated load balancing systems, designed to manage supply and demand, begin exhibiting behaviors that would puzzle any electrical engineer. With demand dropping precipitously as facilities shut down or burn out, the systems start shedding load in ways they were never programmed to handle. It's almost like the grid is having a nervous breakdown, fluctuating wildly as it tries to balance an equation that no longer makes sense. Voltage spikes burn out sensitive equipment. Frequency variations trigger automatic shutdowns. The elegant dance of electricity distribution, perfected over decades, becomes a chaotic thrashing that destroys more equipment every day. By the end of the first month, even the most robust parts of the electrical grid begin to fail from simple neglect. Transformers overheat without proper maintenance. Transmission lines develop faults that would normally be repaired within hours, but now go uncorrected. Nature begins reclaiming the infrastructure with shocking speed. Vines growing over power lines, trees falling across transmission corridors, ice storms and wind events that would normally trigger immediate repair efforts, now causing permanent damage. The darkness spreading across the continent isn't just about failed power plants. It's about the realization that everything we took for granted, every flip of a switch, every turn of a tap, every assumption about tomorrow being like today, was balanced on a knife's edge of complexity that we never fully appreciated. But here's the thing that nobody expected. As the lights go out forever across the industrial landscape, something else begins to happen. Something that starts so quietly, so gradually, that it would take months for anyone to notice. The air starts to clear. Without millions of cars burning fossil fuels, without thousands of factories belching smoke, without the constant background emissions of industrial civilization, the atmosphere begins what will become the most dramatic environmental recovery in human history. It starts small, a slightly bluer sky over Los Angeles, a little less haze over the industrial Midwest, but it's the beginning of something extraordinary. That's what we're going to explore next time, as we witness Earth taking its first deep breath in over 2 centuries. Because while humanity struggles with the collapse of everything they built, the planet itself begins the most remarkable comeback story you've never imagined. The silence of the machines isn't just an ending, it's also a beginning. 1 month after the vanishing, something extraordinary happens in Los Angeles. And when I say extraordinary, I mean something that hasn't occurred in over 80 years. The city experiences its first crystal-clear day since 1943. Picture this. Dr. Elena Vasquez, one of the surviving astronomers at Mount Wilson Observatory, steps outside her makeshift shelter at dawn on November 15th. She's been living rough for weeks now, scavenging supplies from abandoned buildings, trying to keep the observatory's basic functions running with a skeleton crew of 3 other survivors. The city below has been silent for days. No traffic, no industrial hum, no constant background noise of 8 million people going about their lives. But when Elena looks toward downtown Los Angeles that morning, she literally stops breathing for a moment. The San Gabriel Mountains, which had been invisible from the city for decades, stand out in sharp relief against the horizon. She can see individual trees on mountainsides 40 miles away. The Hollywood sign, usually obscured by a brown haze of smog, gleams white against the hillside like a beacon. For the first time in her 47 years of life, Elena can see the actual shape of the Los Angeles basin. The natural contours of the land, hidden for generations under a blanket of pollution, emerge like a lost landscape rising from fog. She realizes she's witnessing something that no living person has ever seen. Los Angeles, as it existed before the automobile age, transformed it into the smog capital of the world. But here's the truly incredible part. That night, Elena climbs to the observatory's main telescope, the same one that captured some of the most famous images in astronomical history, before light pollution made serious stellar photography impossible from Mount Wilson. She's hoping to do some basic maintenance, maybe get a few instruments running again. But when she looks through the eyepiece, she's stunned into silence. Stars. Thousands of them. Stars that haven't been visible from Los Angeles since the 1940s shine with brilliant clarity. The Milky Way, that ghostly river of light that urban Americans have forgotten exists, stretches across the sky like a cosmic highway. Elena finds herself weeping, not from grief for the vanished world, but from the overwhelming beauty of what has been hidden all along. She spends the entire night cataloguing stars, taking notes by candlelight, documenting celestial objects that haven't been observable from Southern California in 80 years. The Andromeda Galaxy, M42 in Orion, the double cluster in Perseus. Objects that required trips to remote desert locations are now visible from downtown Los Angeles. But the transformation isn't limited to what you can see. It's what you can hear, or rather, what you can't hear anymore. Across the Pacific, marine biologist Dr. Kenji Nakamura experiences his own moment of revelation. Kenji survived the vanishing while conducting research at a remote station in the Aleutian Islands, and for weeks he's been trying to maintain his equipment, hoping to document how marine ecosystems respond to the sudden absence of human activity. On December 3rd, exactly 5 weeks after the vanishing, Kenji lowers his hydrophones into the North Pacific and hears something that makes him question his own sanity. Silence. Complete, profound, oceanic silence. For the first time since the Industrial Revolution began, the ocean is quiet. Think about this for a moment. For over 2 centuries, our oceans have been filled with the constant noise of human activity. Cargo ships grinding across trade routes, their massive diesel engines creating a low-frequency rumble that travels for thousands of miles underwater. Military sonar pulses bouncing off the seafloor. Oil drilling platforms hammering into the ocean bed. Fishing fleets dragging nets across continental shelves. The background noise level in many parts of the ocean had increased by 30 decibels since pre-industrial times. That's a 1,000-fold increase in sound intensity. But now, for the first time in centuries, marine mammals can hear each other again. Kenji adjusts his equipment and picks up something that brings tears to his eyes. Whale songs. Not the fragmentary calls he's used to hearing, chopped up and masked by shipping noise, but complete, uninterrupted vocalizations, traveling unimpeded for thousands of miles. A humpback whale singing off the coast of Alaska can be heard clearly by her pod members near Hawaii. Blue whales, whose low-frequency calls had been reduced to a range of just a few dozen miles by industrial noise, can now communicate across entire ocean basins. Dolphins and porpoises, which rely on echolocation to navigate and hunt, suddenly find their acoustic world transformed. Imagine living your entire life in a room where someone is constantly running a leaf blower, and then suddenly the noise stops. That's what these marine mammals are experiencing. Their echolocation becomes precise again. Their hunting efficiency improves dramatically. Their social communications become rich and complex in ways that had been suppressed for generations. But perhaps the most dramatic changes are happening thousands of miles away, in the Amazon rainforest. Dr. Carlos Mendoza, a botanist who survived the vanishing while conducting field research in the remote Acre region, witnesses something that would have been impossible under normal circumstances. The jungle doesn't just begin to reclaim human-cleared areas, it launches an assault. You see, cattle ranching in the Amazon requires constant vigilance. Ranchers must continuously clear new growth, burn back invading vegetation, and maintain clear boundaries between pasture and forest. It's a never-ending battle against one of the most aggressive ecosystems on Earth. But when the ranchers vanish along with half of humanity, that battle is immediately lost. Carlos watches in amazement as pioneer species, those weedy, fast-growing plants that specialize in colonizing disturbed ground, explode across abandoned cattle ranches. Within 2 weeks, Cecropia trees, which can grow 15 feet in a single year, begin sprouting across former pastures. Fast-growing grasses that ranchers spent decades trying to eliminate surge back with a vengeance. By the end of the first month, Carlos documents something unprecedented in modern ecological history. 3 million hectares of former cattle pasture, an area larger than Belgium, transforms into impenetrable green walls of vegetation. The jungle doesn't creep back gradually, as scientists had predicted it might. It charges back like a green tsunami. If you could see satellite images of this transformation, it would look like time-lapse footage of mold-consuming bread. Brown patches of cleared land turn green almost overnight. Former ranch roads disappear under curtains of vines. Cattle fences, which once marked clear boundaries between civilization and wilderness, become green tunnels as vegetation grows over and through them. But the real surprise comes from above, literally. Without jet contrails crisscrossing the sky, without industrial emissions altering atmospheric chemistry, the Amazon's weather patterns begin to shift in ways that climate scientists had only theorized about. You see, the Amazon rainforest doesn't just depend on rainfall from the Atlantic Ocean. It creates its own weather through a process called transpiration. The trees release enormous amounts of water vapor into the atmosphere, so much that scientists call it the flying rivers of the Amazon. These atmospheric currents carry more water than the Amazon River itself, creating a feedback loop where the forest generates the rain that sustains it. But industrial emissions, jet contrails, and atmospheric pollution had been disrupting these delicate patterns for decades. The Amazon had been slowly transforming from rainforest into savanna, a process that climate scientists feared would accelerate into runaway change. The flying rivers had weakened by nearly 20% since the 1970s. Now, without human interference, these aerial rivers strengthened by 40% within 6 months. Carlos documents rainfall increases that seem almost impossible. Areas that had been experiencing severe drought suddenly received deluges that transform the landscape. Rivers that had shrunk to streams become torrents again. Springs that had dried up decades earlier begin flowing. The transformation is so rapid, so dramatic, that Carlos begins to understand something profound about the relationship between human activity and natural systems. The Amazon hadn't been slowly dying from climate change. It had been fighting a constant battle against human interference. Once that interference stops, the forest recovery is explosive. Meanwhile, in the world's oceans, an even more dramatic transformation is underway. Every single day that passes without industrial fishing removes approximately 5 million tons of biomass extraction from marine ecosystems. That might not sound like much until you realize that over decades, this constant harvesting pressure had reduced fish populations to a tiny fraction of their historical levels. Most commercial fish species existed at less than 10% of their pre-industrial abundance, but fish populations don't recover linearly, they recover exponentially when given the chance. Dr. Yuki Tanaka, a marine biologist who survived the vanishing while researching bluefin tuna populations in the Western Pacific, documents what can only be described as an explosion of marine life. Bluefin tuna, which had been reduced to fewer than 50,000 breeding individuals worldwide, begin a recovery that defies every mathematical model. These are fish that can live for decades, that don't reach sexual maturity until they're 10 years old, that were considered functionally extinct in many parts of their historical range. Before the vanishing, A single bluefin tuna could sell for $300,000 in Tokyo's fish markets. They were literally worth more than gold. But within 5 years of the vanishing, Yuki documents bluefin populations in the millions. Without fishing pressure, without the massive purseine nets that could capture entire schools at once, without the long-line fishing operations that killed them as bycatch, these magnificent predators multiply at rates that would have seemed impossible. The Great Sardine Shoals off the coast of Peru tell an even more dramatic story. Before industrial fishing, these shoals were measured in billions of tons, vast silvery masses that darkened the ocean for miles. By 2025, they had been reduced to a few million tons, supporting only a fraction of the marine ecosystem they once sustained. But sardines are prolific breeders. Under the right conditions, their populations can double every year. Without fishing fleets harvesting them, without climate change disrupting their spawning cycles, without ocean acidification affecting their food sources, the sardine populations explode beyond anything in recorded history. Dr. Rosa Martinez, conducting research from a small coastal station in Chile, documents sardine shoals that stretch for hundreds of miles. From her clifftop observation post, she watches schools so vast that they turn the ocean black, supporting millions of seabirds that had been on the verge of extinction just years before. But perhaps the most spectacular recovery belongs to the ocean's apex predators, sharks. Sharks had been among the most heavily impacted marine species. Slow to mature, slow to reproduce, vulnerable to overfishing at every stage of their lives, shark populations had crashed by 90% in most parts of the world's oceans. Many species existed only in small, isolated populations, clinging to survival in remote marine reserves. Dr. James Robertson, a shark researcher who survived the vanishing while working at a remote station in the Bahamas, documents a recovery that seems almost miraculous. Great white sharks, which had been reduced to perhaps 10,000 individuals worldwide, begin multiplying rapidly without fishing pressure, and with abundant prey species recovering. But it's not just the numbers, it's the ecosystem effects. Sharks are what ecologists call a keystone species. Their presence affects the behavior and distribution of every other species in the marine food web. When shark populations crash, fish behavior changes, algae growth patterns shift, entire reef ecosystems can collapse. Now, with shark populations recovering rapidly, these ecosystem effects reverse. Fish species that had been driven to near extinction by uncontrolled grazing pressure begin recovering as sharks control herbivore populations. Coral reefs, which had been devastated not just by warming and acidification but by ecological imbalances, begin showing signs of recovery as natural predator-prey relationships restore themselves. Within 2 decades, some shark species will increase 50-fold. The hammerhead sharks of the Galapagos, once reduced to a few dozen individuals, will number in the hundreds of thousands. Tiger sharks will once again patrol the warm waters of the Caribbean in numbers not seen since the colonial era. But the most profound change is one that you can only appreciate if you understand the deep history of our planet's oceans. For millions of years, Earth's marine ecosystems existed in a state of abundance that modern humans can barely imagine. Oceans teeming with life from surface to seafloor, food webs of incredible complexity and resilience, populations of marine megafauna that would dwarf anything in the historical record. Industrial fishing had reduced this abundance to a shadow of its former self in just 2 centuries. But now, for the first time in over 200 years, marine ecosystems are beginning to express their full biological potential. Dr. Chen Wei, an oceanographer monitoring the South China Sea from the research station in the Philippines, documents changes that read like science fiction. Kelp forests, which had been reduced to tiny fragments, begin expanding at rates of several miles per year. Fish populations that had existed only in old fishermen's stories begin reappearing in surveys. Species thought to be extinct start showing up in underwater cameras. The ocean isn't just recovering, it's remembering what it used to be. And it's not just the oceans. Across the planet, in forests and grasslands, in rivers and lakes, in mountains and deserts, nature begins what can only be described as the greatest comeback in Earth's recent history. The absence of human pressure doesn't just allow recovery, it unleashes the full creative power of natural systems that had been suppressed for centuries. Bird populations explode as pesticide use stops and habitats go undisturbed. Insect populations, which had been crashing globally, recover with stunning speed. Plant species that had been driven to tiny refugia begin expanding their ranges. Predator populations, freed from hunting pressure and habitat destruction, begin restoring natural balances that had been disrupted for generations. But perhaps the most remarkable change is the simple return of silence and darkness to the natural world. Without the constant noise of human civilization, without the glow of artificial lights, Earth begins to remember rhythms that had been disrupted for centuries. This is just the beginning of the story, because while nature celebrates its liberation, the 4 billion humans who remain face the enormous challenge of learning to live in this transformed world. And that transformation, both of the planet and of humanity itself, is what we'll explore next time. The question isn't whether Earth can recover from human impact. The question is whether humanity can learn to live as part of the recovery instead of working against it. Sarah Chen spent 12 years learning to write elegant code. It takes her 6 months to learn to forge a horseshoe. Picture this. A woman who once debugged complex algorithms for self-driving cars now stands in front of a coal forge in Mendocino County, sweat streaming down her face, learning to shape red-hot iron with hammer and anvil. The transition from Silicon Valley software engineer to rural blacksmith isn't one she chose, it's one that chose her, along with every other survivor who wants to eat regularly and stay warm when winter comes. Sarah's story is the story of 4 billion human beings learning the hardest lesson of their lives. Complexity kills when the supply chains disappear. You see, Sarah's community of 300 survivors discovered what every surviving group learns within the first 6 months. All those sophisticated devices that defined modern life, smartphones, laptops, electric vehicles, smart home systems, they don't just stop working when the power goes out. They become useless sculptures, monuments to a level of technological complexity that only existed because 7 billion people were working together to maintain it. Think about something as simple as a computer chip. Creating one requires materials from dozens of countries, manufacturing processes involving hundreds of specialized companies, and supply chains that span the globe. When half the world vanishes, and most of the other half is struggling just to find clean water, nobody's making computer chips anymore. The factories are dark, the raw materials aren't being mined, the specialized knowledge is scattered among survivors who have more pressing concerns than maintaining Moore's law. But here's the remarkable thing about human adaptability. We're not just good at using tools, we're good at making tools. And when the complex tools stop working, we remember how to make simple ones. Sarah's transformation from programmer to metalworker happens out of necessity. Her community needs horseshoes because horses, it turns out, are the most reliable transportation technology when there's no gasoline, no roads being maintained, and no replacement parts for anything with an engine. They need kitchen knives because stainless steel cutlery becomes precious when you can't order replacements online. They need nails and hinges and door latches because civilization still requires doors, even if those doors are made by hand instead of mass-produced in factories. So Sarah learns to read iron the way she once read code. She discovers that metal has moods, how it glows different colors at different temperatures, how it responds to the hammer differently when it's hot versus warm, how carbon content changes everything about how it behaves. It's pattern recognition, just like programming, but with consequences that burn your hands if you get it wrong. And you know what's surprising? After the first brutal months of learning, Sarah finds herself happier than she's been in years. There's something deeply satisfying about creating physical objects that solve real problems. Every horseshoe she forges helps someone travel. Every knife she sharpens helps someone prepare food. Every tool she repairs extends someone's ability to build, to grow, to survive. Her community, like thousands of others across North America, rediscovers that a 19th century lifestyle isn't just possible. It's surprisingly fulfilling when you're not competing with 7 billion other people for resources. Without the pressure of global markets, without the artificial scarcity created by complex distribution systems, without the constant stress of maintaining your position in an economy that never sleeps, life becomes both simpler and richer. They grow their own food in gardens that don't require industrial fertilizers or pesticides. They preserve meat through smoking and salt-curing techniques that worked for thousands of years before refrigeration. They heat their homes with wood stoves that provide warmth without depending on electrical grids or natural gas pipelines. They make their own soap, their own candles, their own clothes. But here's what nobody expected. Which communities thrive and which ones collapse has nothing to do with wealth or education level, and everything to do with practical knowledge. Silicon Valley, despite containing some of the most intelligent and well-educated people on the planet, fails catastrophically. The venture capitalists, who once commanded billion-dollar portfolios, discover that their expertise in financial instruments doesn't translate to identifying edible plants. Software engineers who could design elegant user interfaces can't figure out how to build a simple chicken coop. The abstract knowledge that made them successful in the digital economy proves almost useless for basic survival. Dr. Michael Chang, a former Google executive who survived the vanishing, puts it this way: "We knew everything about artificial intelligence and nothing about actual intelligence, the kind that tells you which mushrooms will kill you and which berries are safe to eat." Meanwhile, 200 miles north, the Amish communities of Northern California barely notice that the apocalypse has happened. When the power goes out permanently, the Amish shrug and continue using the oil lamps they've always used. When gasoline becomes unavailable, they hitch up the horses they've been driving all along. When supply chains collapse and stores empty out, they harvest vegetables from gardens they've been tending for generations. When modern medicine becomes inaccessible, they treat illnesses with herbal remedies that their grandmothers taught them. The Amish, who numbered only about 300,000 across North America before the vanishing, suddenly find themselves in possession of the most valuable knowledge on the continent. They know how to breed horses, how to forge iron, how to preserve food without refrigeration, how to build houses without power tools, how to treat sick animals, how to make soap and candles and textiles from raw materials. Within 2 years, horse breeding becomes the most valuable skill in North America. The Amish, who had been quietly maintaining bloodlines of working horses while the rest of the world switched to automobiles, suddenly become the teachers that millions of survivors desperately need. Young people who once mocked Amish technology as backward now walk hundreds of miles to Amish communities, hoping to learn skills that mean the difference between thriving and starving. Jacob Miller, an Amish farmer in Pennsylvania, finds himself teaching horse management to former stockbrokers and marketing executives. "They come to us with soft hands and big ideas," he says, "but they learn fast when their bellies are empty." The psychological journey that survivors go through follows a predictable pattern across all communities, regardless of their ultimate success or failure. First comes what psychologists call the searching phase. For about 3 months after the vanishing, survivors remain convinced that their missing loved ones will return. They post messages on walls, they search abandoned buildings, they organize expeditions to distant cities, hoping to find family members who vanished. The searching is frantic, desperate, all-consuming. Sarah spends her first month walking the streets of San Francisco, calling her sister's name, checking every coffee shop and bookstore where Lisa might have gone that Tuesday morning. She breaks into Lisa's apartment and finds breakfast dishes in the sink, coffee still in the pot, but no sign of where her sister went or why she didn't come back. The searching phase ends differently for different people, but it always ends the same way, with the crushing realization that the vanished aren't coming back. Nobody knows where they went, or why they were taken, or what happened to them. They're simply gone, as completely as if they had never existed. That's when the mourning period begins. From months 4 through 9, survivor communities experience collective depression unlike anything in recorded psychology. It's not just grief for lost individuals, it's grief for lost civilization, lost knowledge, lost possibilities. Survivors understand that everything they once knew is gone forever. The restaurants they loved, the movies they were looking forward to, the plans they had made, the future they had imagined, all of it evaporated in a single impossible morning. During this period, many communities barely function. People go through the motions of survival, gathering food, maintaining shelter, treating illnesses, but there's no joy in it, no sense of building toward anything better. They're just existing, day by day, waiting for something to change or for the pain to stop. Suicide rates spike during this period, but not as dramatically as mental health experts had predicted. Even in the depths of despair, humans seem to possess an innate drive to keep going, to see what happens next, to hold on to the possibility that tomorrow might be different from today. And then, sometime around the 1-year mark, something remarkable happens. Psychologists call it the acceptance transformation, and it occurs across communities with stunning consistency. Survivors stop looking backward and start building forward. It's not that they forget their losses or stop grieving for the vanished world, but something fundamental shifts in their psychology. They begin to see possibilities instead of just problems. They start planning for next year instead of just surviving today. They begin to imagine that the future might be different from the past. Not worse, just different. Sarah marks her own transformation on the day she plants an apple orchard. It's exactly 13 months after the vanishing, and she's standing in a field outside the community, holding saplings that won't bear fruit for 5 years. The act of planting trees that will outlive the current crisis, that will feed children not yet born, represents a kind of faith in the future that she couldn't have imagined during the dark months of mourning. But the most dramatic psychological change is the explosion in birth rates. Within 2 years of the vanishing, pregnancy rates in survivor communities increase by 300%. At first, people assume it's just practical. Communities need children to work and to care for adults as they age. But the deeper truth is more profound. Humans seem to possess a deep biological imperative to refill the world after catastrophe. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a psychologist who survived the vanishing while visiting a rural clinic in New Mexico, documents this phenomenon across dozens of communities. It's not just about practical needs, she observes. These aren't planned pregnancies based on economic calculations. It's something more primal, a species-level response to massive population loss. Young couples who had been postponing children in the old world due to career concerns or financial worries suddenly find themselves desperate to start families. Older couples who thought their childbearing years were behind them begin trying for one more child. Single women seek out sperm donors, not for emotional fulfillment, but from what can only be described as a biological imperative to participate in species recovery. The baby boom transforms communities in unexpected ways. Children born after the vanishing grow up in a world completely different from their parents' childhood, but they adapt to it with the resilience that children always display. They learn to ride horses before they could have learned to drive cars. They master hand tools while their parents still fumble with them. They speak the languages of farming and crafting as fluently as their parents once spoke the languages of technology and commerce. But perhaps the most surprising psychological finding is that suicide rates, which experts predicted would skyrocket, actually plummet below pre-vanishing levels by year 2. Communities that seem doomed to despair transform into beacons of hope. The constant anxiety that characterized modern life, the pressure to succeed, the fear of falling behind, the uncertainty about the future, simply evaporates when survival becomes the measure of success and community becomes the source of security. People sleep better in the post-vanishing world. They report higher levels of life satisfaction despite material hardships. Depression and anxiety disorders, which had reached epidemic levels in the old world, become rare in survivor communities. Mental health improves dramatically when life has clear, immediate purpose, and when every individual's contribution directly impacts their community's well-being. Dr. James Park, a psychiatrist who survived while visiting a rural clinic in Oregon, notes that humans are psychologically adapted for exactly the kind of challenges they face after the vanishing. We evolved to live in small communities, to solve immediate practical problems, to depend on each other for survival. Modern civilization created psychological stresses we were never designed to handle. The transformation isn't just individual, it's cultural. Survivor communities develop new traditions, new celebrations, new ways of marking time and meaning. The anniversary of the vanishing becomes not a day of mourning but a day of gratitude for survival and remembrance of resilience. Harvest festivals take on sacred significance when everyone in the community participated in growing the food. Weddings become community celebrations involving dozens of people because every new family strengthens the social fabric that keeps everyone alive. Music flourishes in unexpected ways. Without recorded music, without amplification, without the infinite catalogue of digital entertainment, people rediscover the joy of making music together. Communities develop signature songs, musical traditions that reflect their particular history and challenges. Storytelling becomes high art again, as people gather around fires to share tales that connect past to present to future. Children born after the vanishing will grow up believing that this transformed world is normal. They'll learn about the old world from their parents' stories, but they won't miss it because they never experienced it. They'll be perfectly adapted to a life of physical work, seasonal rhythms, community interdependence, and technological simplicity. These children represent something unprecedented in human history, a generation that grows up with deep practical knowledge instead of abstract information, with strong communities instead of global networks, with immediate purpose instead of existential uncertainty. They'll be happier than their parents were in the old world, though they'll measure happiness differently. Sarah watches these children play in the fields around her community and realizes that they're not growing up in a post-apocalyptic wasteland. They're growing up in a world that's more human-scaled, more comprehensible, more directly connected to the natural systems that support all life. It's not the world she would have chosen, but it's becoming a world she's proud to be part of building. But individual communities adapting is just the beginning of the story. The real question is, what happens to human knowledge, human culture, human civilization when you lose the complex systems that preserved and transmitted them? And that's where our story takes a turn that nobody saw coming. Because while communities like Sarah's are learning to thrive in a simpler world, they're also losing something irreplaceable, the accumulated knowledge of 10,000 years of human progress. And that loss will reshape human civilization in ways that will echo for centuries to come. The Great Forgetting begins with a 5-year-old girl asking her father what a car is. Picture this: little Emma Rodriguez, born 2 years after the vanishing, sits by the fireplace in her family's cabin in rural Vermont, listening to her father tell stories about the before times. He's trying to explain how people used to travel, how they would climb into metal boxes with wheels and move faster than horses across great distances. Emma listens politely, the way children do when adults tell obvious fairy tales, and then asks the question that breaks her father's heart. But Papa, why didn't the cars have legs if they needed to move? To Emma, transportation means walking or riding horses, metal boxes that move by themselves, powered by invisible explosions of refined dinosaur juice, make no more sense than flying carpets or 7-league boots. Her father might as well be describing magic, because to a child who has never seen electricity, the old world is indistinguishable from magic. This is the reality facing every survivor community 5 years after the vanishing. Children born into the new world cannot comprehend their parents' stories. Try explaining TikTok to a child who has never seen a screen. Try describing the internet to someone who thinks the most advanced form of communication is sending letters by horseback. Try conveying the concept of a smartphone to a young person whose most complex tool is a hand-cranked grain mill. The generation gap isn't measured in years, it's measured in entire civilizations. Dr. Rebecca Kim, a former professor of information science at MIT, experiences this disconnect every day as she tries to educate the children in her Boston survivor community. She attempts to explain what libraries used to be, how you could access any book ever written with a few keystrokes, how human knowledge was instantly available to anyone, anywhere. The children nod politely and ask if she's telling them another story about the sky spirits who supposedly stored all the world's memories in invisible clouds. To them, the idea that knowledge could exist without being written on paper by human hands is pure mythology. The knowledge preservation efforts are heroic but largely futile. Rebecca and her team of 37 MIT survivors attempt to hand copy the most critical information from the university's libraries before the books deteriorate beyond reading. They work by candlelight, transcribing everything from basic engineering principles to medical procedures to agricultural techniques. But here's the crushing irony. They're surrounded by the greatest library in human history, and they can save less than medieval monks preserved. In the first year, working 12 hours a day, Rebecca's team manages to hand copy perhaps 3,000 pages of critical knowledge. That sounds impressive until you realize that MIT's libraries contained over 5 million books, each averaging 300 pages. They're trying to preserve 1.5 billion pages of human knowledge, and at their current rate, they'll preserve about 1/10,000th of it before they run out of paper, ink, or human endurance. The selection process becomes agonizing. Do you preserve the complete works of Shakespeare or basic medical procedures? Do you copy advanced mathematics or practical farming techniques? Every page they choose means thousands of other pages lost forever. It's like trying to save civilization one grain of sand at a time while watching the entire beach wash away. And the practical challenges are overwhelming. Paper deteriorates rapidly without climate control. Ink is precious when you can't order new supplies online. Hand copying is incredibly slow and prone to errors. A single mistake in transcribing a chemical formula or medical dosage could kill someone in the future. By year 3, Rebecca's team has managed to preserve perhaps 50,000 pages of critical knowledge, an achievement that would have impressed scribes in the Dark Ages, but represents less than 1% of what they hope to save. The rest of human knowledge, accumulated over centuries, dies with the servers and hard drives that no one knows how to maintain. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. While vast libraries of information disappear forever, humanity's creativity explodes in directions that no one anticipated. Music, freed from electronic amplification and digital reproduction, evolves into something that would make Bach weep with joy. Without the ability to record and replay music, every performance becomes unique, irreplaceable, precious. Musicians must develop their skills to extraordinary levels because there are no second chances, no auto-tune, no post-production magic. In Sarah Chen's community in Mendocino, evening music sessions become the highlight of every day. 23 people with varying musical abilities gather around the fire to create complex vocal harmonies that they could never have achieved in the old world. Without the distraction of recorded music, without the passive consumption of other people's creativity, they become active creators themselves. The harmonies they develop are unlike anything in the recorded music tradition. They're not trying to recreate songs from the past. They're creating new musical forms adapted to their particular voices, their specific acoustic environment, their community's emotional needs. It's music as it existed for thousands of years before recording technology, but enriched by survivors who remember harmony and melody from the old world. Dr. Marcus Thompson, a former ethnomusicologist who survived the vanishing while studying indigenous music in New Mexico, documents this musical renaissance across dozens of communities. They're not just preserving musical knowledge, he observes. They're creating entirely new traditions, music that could only exist in this specific time and place, performed by these specific people. Storytelling transforms from casual entertainment into high art, becoming the vital thread that connects past to future. Without books, without movies, without the internet, stories become the primary way that knowledge, values, and cultural memory pass from one generation to the next. But these aren't just retellings of old stories. New myths emerge almost immediately, and they reframe the vanishing in ways that help communities make sense of their transformed world. The vanishing doesn't remain a random catastrophe in these emerging mythologies. It becomes a moral lesson, a cosmic correction, a necessary transformation. The before times become characterized not as a golden age lost, but as a period of dangerous excess that required correction. Children learn cautionary tales of the glass speakers, people who stared at glowing rectangles instead of seeing the world around them. They hear warnings about the cloud worshippers who sent their memories into the sky, where they burned when the false gods abandoned them. They're told stories of the speed demons who moved too fast to notice the beauty around them, who lived their entire lives without ever being truly present. These myths aren't bitter or angry. They're explanatory, helping children understand why the world changed and why the new way might be better than the old. The stories don't demonize technology itself, but warn against losing human connection, against valuing efficiency over meaning, against mistaking information for wisdom. Little Emma, who couldn't understand what a car was, easily comprehends the story of the metal beasts that ate all the clean air and made the sky sick, and how the world became healthier when the beasts finally went to sleep. It's a story that makes sense in her world of horses and gardens and clear blue skies. But perhaps the most profound change isn't what people think about or create. It's how they experience time itself. Without clocks, smartphones, and rigid schedules, human time perception shifts from minutes to seasons. Sarah Chen, who once lived by calendar alerts and deadline countdowns, finds herself measuring time by the cycles of her garden, the phases of the moon, the migration patterns of birds. This isn't just a lifestyle change, it's a fundamental alteration in consciousness. Modern humans had been trained to slice time into ever smaller increments, to optimize every moment, to squeeze productivity from every available minute. The constant awareness of precise time created a background stress that most people didn't even realize they carried. Now, without that constant temporal pressure, something remarkable happens to human psychology. Depression and anxiety, which had reached epidemic levels in the before times, virtually disappear from survivor communities. The constant cortisol drip of modern life stops, and humans rediscover their natural rhythms. Dr. Lisa Patel, a psychiatrist who survived while visiting a rural clinic in Montana, documents this temporal transformation across multiple communities. People sleep better, they report higher life satisfaction, they experience less chronic stress. It's not just that their circumstances are simpler, their entire relationship with time has changed. Sleep patterns align with sunset and sunrise for the first time in most people's lives. Without artificial light extending the day, without screens emitting blue light that disrupts circadian rhythms, Without the anxiety-inducing news cycle keeping minds racing at bedtime, people fall asleep when darkness comes and wake when light returns. The effects cascade through every aspect of human biology. Menstrual cycles, disrupted by artificial light and chronic stress in the old world, synchronize within communities as they did for thousands of years before electric lighting. Women living together begin ovulating at the same time, their bodies responding to natural light cycles and reduce stress. Hormones. Even aging seems to slow down. Survivors who make it past the first terrible year often live longer than their pre-vanishing life expectancy. Without processed food, without chronic stress, without the constant low-level inflammation of modern life, human bodies return to more natural patterns of aging. Dr. Jonathan Wright, a gerontologist studying aging in survivor communities, notes that people in their 60s are functioning like they're in their 40s. Their skin is clearer, their energy levels are higher, their cognitive function is sharper. It's as if modern life was aging people prematurely, and now that those stresses are gone, their bodies are remembering how to be healthy. The relationship with food changes completely. Without restaurants, without grocery stores, without the ability to eat strawberries in December or bananas in Alaska, people rediscover seasonal eating. They experience hunger in ways that make food precious again. They understand the direct connection between the health of their soil and the health of their bodies. Sarah Chen, who once grabbed processed snacks from convenience stores without thinking, now knows the growing cycle of every plant in her garden. She understands which herbs heal which ailments, which foods provide which nutrients, which preservation methods maintain nutritional value through winter. Her relationship with food becomes intimate, knowledgeable, grateful in ways that no amount of nutritional education in the old world could have achieved. Work transforms from abstract labor into concrete creation. People make things they can see and touch, solve problems that have immediate visible results, contribute to their community's well-being in ways that are obvious and appreciated. The existential question, "What's the point of my job?" simply doesn't exist when your work directly impacts whether your community eats well or stays warm. Children grow up understanding cause and effect in immediate, physical ways. They see that neglecting the garden means less food next winter. They learn that shoddy craftsmanship results in tools that break when you need them most. They develop work ethics based not on external expectations but on natural consequences. But the most profound change might be the return of genuine community. Without social media creating the illusion of connection, without entertainment media providing passive stimulation, without the ability to travel easily or communicate across distances, people invest deeply in the relationships available to them. Communities develop intimacy levels that would have been impossible in the old world. Everyone knows everyone else's skills, fears, hopes, and stories. People depend on each other for survival in ways that create bonds deeper than most modern families ever experienced. Social isolation, which had become epidemic in the pre-vanishing world, becomes literally impossible when community cooperation is necessary for survival. The elderly, who had often been marginalized in the old world's emphasis on youth and innovation, become treasured repositories of knowledge and wisdom. Young people seek out their guidance not out of politeness, but out of genuine need for their experience and practical knowledge. Children grow up surrounded by adults who all have a stake in their development, who all contribute to their education, who all help shape their character. It takes a village to raise a child, and now every child has a village again. The knowledge that disappears in the Great Forgetting isn't just information, it's an entire way of understanding the world. Future generations will find it nearly impossible to comprehend how human beings once lived in a state of constant connection to global networks, constant stimulation from digital media, constant pressure to optimize and achieve and accumulate. But what they gain might be more valuable than what they lose. They rediscover what it means to be fully present, deeply connected, intimately knowledgeable about their immediate environment and community. They develop what their ancestors would have recognized as wisdom, the kind that comes from direct experience rather than abstract learning. This isn't the end of human progress, it's the beginning of a different kind of progress. One that measures advancement not by the complexity of technology, but by the quality of life, not by the speed of change, but by the sustainability of systems, not by individual achievement, but by community well-being. And as these new communities mature and stabilize, as children born after the vanishing become adults themselves, the stage is set for something unprecedented in human history, a chance to rebuild civilization with the benefit of hindsight, with an understanding of where the old path led, with the opportunity to choose a different direction. That's what we'll explore next time, as we witness nature's complete recovery and humanity's gradual awakening to what a truly sustainable civilization might look like. Because while humans are learning to live differently, the planet itself is undergoing the most dramatic transformation in millions of years. 100 years after the vanishing, Manhattan is unrecognizable. And when I say unrecognizable, I mean that if you could somehow transport a New Yorker from 2025 to 2125, they would need a map to find Broadway. Picture this. Dr. Elena Vasquez Chen, great-great-granddaughter of Sarah Chen the blacksmith, leads her monthly pilgrimage to the ruins of the great city. She's a forest ecologist now, documenting the transformation of North America's eastern coast, and her specialty is understanding what scientists call urban succession, how nature reclaims human spaces when humans step aside. Elena stands on what was once the observation deck of the Empire State Building, but she's not standing on concrete anymore, she's standing among the roots of a massive American elm tree that has grown up through the building's core, its trunk filling what was once the elevator shaft, its canopy spreading across Manhattan like a green umbrella 300 feet above the street. The elm is over 60 feet in diameter, larger than any elm that existed before Dutch elm disease decimated the species in the 20th century. Without human intervention, without the constant pressure of urban development, without the diseases that spread through monoculture urban plantings, the elm population has not just recovered but evolved. These new urban elms show resistance to diseases that would have killed their ancestors, genetic diversity that comes from natural selection instead of human breeding programs. From Elena's perch in the elm's canopy, she can see the entire transformed island. Manhattan, which was originally covered in forest before the Dutch arrived in 1624, has come full circle. The bedrock that once supported skyscrapers now anchors root systems of trees that dwarf the buildings they've consumed. The grid of streets, still visible in places as channels between forest groves, has become a network of streams and small rivers fed by natural springs. But the most remarkable sight is Times Square, that former nexus of human ambition and commercial energy. Where millions of people once passed daily under blazing electronic billboards, Elena sees something that would have delighted any ecosystem engineer: a massive beaver dam. The beavers discovered Manhattan about 30 years after the vanishing, swimming up the Hudson River as water levels rose and fish populations exploded. They found a landscape perfectly suited to their engineering talents, not the natural wetlands they typically prefer, but something even better: a flooded urban environment with abundant building materials and unlimited water sources. You see, when the subway tunnels flooded permanently after the power, they went out. They didn't just become underground rivers. They became the foundation for the most sophisticated aquifer system on the East Coast. The beavers, ecosystem engineers par excellence, recognized the potential immediately. They built their first dam across the flooded Times Square subway station, backing up water that now feeds springs throughout southern Manhattan. Elena descends through the elm's branches to ground level, where she can walk along the old subway platforms, now elevated wooden walkways that the beaver colony maintains as part of their dam system. The engineering is remarkable, not just the original beaver dam construction, but the way subsequent generations have modified and expanded it using materials from the ruined city. Rebar from collapsed buildings provides structural support for stick and mud constructions that span incredible distances. Broken concrete creates perfect foundation stones for water diversion systems. The beavers have essentially turned the ruins of human civilization into raw materials for their own infrastructure projects. The underground aquifer system they've created supplies fresh water to forest communities throughout Manhattan. Springs bubble up in Central Park, which has become the seed from which wild Manhattan regenerated. What was once nature-tamed, carefully designed landscapes maintained by armies of gardeners has become the launching point for nature unleashed. Elena follows one of these spring-fed streams as it winds through what was once the Upper East Side. The Yorkville neighborhood, once home to luxury apartments and trendy restaurants, is now dominated by a massive wetland complex where great blue herons nest in apartment buildings and river otters play in flooded basements. But Manhattan's transformation is just one small example of changes happening across the entire planet. The century of human absence has allowed Earth to remember what it was like before industrial civilization began, reshaping every ecosystem. The climate has shifted dramatically, but not catastrophically. Without industrial emissions pumping 40 billion tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere annually, the atmospheric CO2 levels have dropped from 420 parts per million to 350. That might not sound like much, but it represents a reversal of over a century of atmospheric change. Global average temperature has decreased by 1.5 degrees Celsius, not enough to trigger an ice age, but sufficient to restore rainfall patterns that had been disrupted since the Industrial Revolution began. The changes aren't uniform across the planet. Some areas cool more than others, some experience more dramatic shifts in precipitation, but overall the climate is returning to patterns that existed before human activity began altering atmospheric chemistry. The most dramatic changes happen in the world's great deserts and drought-stricken regions. The Sahara Desert, which had been advancing southward for centuries due to climate change and overgrazing, begins one of the most spectacular retreats in geological history. The southern edge of the Sahara, which had advanced hundreds of miles into the Sahel region, starts moving north at a rate of several miles per year. Dr. Amara Okonkwo, a climatologist documenting these changes from a research station in former Nigeria, watches rivers return to valleys that had been dry for over a century. Lake Chad, which had shrunk to less than 10% of its historical size by 2025, refills to its 19th century boundaries within 50 years. The transformation happens so rapidly that it's visible in annual satellite photos. Brown desert giving way to green grassland, then to wetlands, then to forests. The American Southwest experiences an even more dramatic transformation. The region had been locked in what climatologists called a mega drought, the worst dry period in over 1,200 years. But without industrial water consumption, without massive agricultural operations in unsuitable climates, without urban development that disrupted natural water cycles, the region's climate begins reverting to historical patterns. Monsoon rains, which had become increasingly rare and unpredictable, return with regularity unknown for centuries. The Colorado River, which had been reduced to a trickle by diversions and drought, flows at levels not seen since the early 1900s. Lake Powell and Lake Mead, which had shrunk to historic lows, refill completely within 30 years. Elena's colleague, Dr. Maria Santos, documents this transformation from a research post in former Arizona. She describes rains that would have seemed impossible to meteorologists of the old world, sustained precipitation events that bring inches of rain to areas that had been lucky to receive inches per year, desert valleys that had been dry since the Dust Bowl era become seasonal lakes, dry washes become year-round streams, but perhaps the most spectacular recoveries happen in the world's oceans. Coral reefs, which had been given up for dead by marine biologists in 2025, begin one of the most remarkable comebacks in the history of life on Earth. Ocean temperatures, which had been rising steadily due to greenhouse gas accumulation, begin cooling as atmospheric CO2 levels drop. Ocean acidification, caused by the absorption of excess atmospheric carbon dioxide, reverses as the oceans reach chemical equilibrium with the new atmospheric composition. The Great Barrier Reef, which had been reduced to 20% of its historical extent by bleaching events and acidification, begins spreading like underwater wildfire. Within 50 years, it returns to its original size. Within a century, it doubles in size, extending into areas where rising, then cooling, ocean temperatures created newly suitable habitat. Dr. Kenji Nakamura's grandson, also a marine biologist, documents this recovery from a research station in former Australia. The reef systems he studies would have seemed impossible to his grandfather's generation. Coral communities of incredible diversity and complexity, with fish populations so abundant that visibility becomes limited by the sheer number of organisms in the water. But the reef recovery isn't limited to historical locations. Entirely new reef systems establish in areas where climate change created suitable conditions. The Mediterranean Sea, which had been too warm for coral growth during the warming period, becomes home to massive reef complexes as temperatures moderate. These aren't transplanted reefs, but entirely new ecosystems, evolved from coral larvae that survived in refugia and spread into newly suitable habitat. The Mediterranean reefs become particularly spectacular because they combine modern coral diversity with the unique conditions of an enclosed sea. Coral species from the Red Sea, the Atlantic, and the Indo-Pacific mix in combinations that never existed before, creating hybrid ecosystems of unprecedented richness. Fish populations throughout the world's oceans reach levels that would have seemed impossible to marine biologists of the Old World. The ocean doesn't just recover its pre-industrial abundance, it exceeds any population levels in recorded history. Without fishing pressure, without industrial pollution, without the constant noise that disrupted migration and feeding patterns, marine ecosystems express their full biological potential for the first time in centuries. The great whale populations tell perhaps the most dramatic story. Blue whales, which had been reduced to fewer than 5,000 individuals worldwide, number in the hundreds of thousands by the end of the century. Humpback whales, which had shown encouraging recovery even before the vanishing, reach population levels not seen since before commercial whaling began. Right whales, grey whales, sperm whales, all recover to numbers that transform ocean ecosystems. But it's not just the large, charismatic species. Sardine populations off the coast of former Peru reach sizes that beggar historical descriptions. Dr. Rosa Martinez's great-grandson documents sardine shoals that stretch across hundreds of square miles of ocean, supporting seabird populations in the millions and whale populations in the thousands. The biomass of fish in these waters exceeds anything in the fossil record. Shark populations experience recoveries that fundamentally alter marine food webs. Great white sharks, tiger sharks, hammerhead sharks, predator species that had been reduced to tiny fractions of their historical numbers, recover to abundances that restore natural balances throughout ocean ecosystems. The cascading effects reshape entire marine food webs. With apex predators controlling herbivore populations, kelp forests expand dramatically. Giant kelp off the California coast grows in forests larger and denser than existed before European colonization. These underwater forests support incredible diversity of marine life while sequestering massive amounts of carbon from the atmosphere. Elena's research brings her to these underwater forests regularly, swimming through kelp canopies that tower 100 feet above the seafloor, surrounded by fish populations so dense they block out sunlight. She experiences marine ecosystems as they existed before human impact, but with the evolutionary diversity that accumulated during the industrial period. The terrestrial changes are equally dramatic but happen more gradually. Forests don't just return to areas where they were cleared, they expand into regions that haven't supported trees for thousands of years. The Great Plains of North America, which had been primarily grassland for millennia, begin supporting oak and maple forests as climate patterns shift and grazing pressure from both domestic and wild animals decreases. The Amazon, the rainforest, which had been on the verge of irreversible collapse before the vanishing, not only recovers but expands dramatically. The flying rivers of atmospheric moisture generated by transpiration strengthen to levels not seen since the Pleistocene. Rainfall increases throughout the Amazon basin, allowing forest expansion into areas that had been savanna for thousands of years. Dr. Carlos Mendoza's descendants document Amazon expansion rates that seem almost impossible. The forest grows eastward into areas of Brazil that had been too dry to support rainforest, northward into Venezuela and Colombia, westward into Peru and Ecuador. Within a century, the Amazon basin supports twice as much forest as existed before European colonization. Similar expansions happen worldwide. The Congo Basin forests spread across Central Africa. Boreal forests expand both north and south from their historical ranges. Temperate rainforests along the Pacific coast of North America extend far inland as precipitation patterns shift. But perhaps the most remarkable transformation happens in the Arctic. Without industrial warming, Arctic ice begins recovering within decades. By the end of the century, summer sea ice extends far beyond its historical minimums. The recovery isn't just quantitative but qualitative. The ice becomes thicker, more stable, more permanent than it had been for over a century. The Arctic ecosystem recovery has global implications. Polar bear populations, which had been on the verge of extinction, recover to numbers not seen since before European exploration of the Arctic began. Walrus populations, ringed seals, Arctic foxes, all recover to abundance levels that support complex predator-prey relationships. The tundra itself begins changing as climate patterns shift. Areas that had been warming rapidly and losing permafrost begin cooling and stabilizing. Massive carbon stores locked in Arctic soils remain frozen, instead of releasing methane and CO2 into the atmosphere. This creates a positive feedback loop. Less atmospheric carbon leads to more cooling, which leads to more carbon storage, which leads to more cooling. Elena studies these changes through careful analysis of atmospheric samples, ice cores, and climate data. The century of recovery isn't just a return to pre-industrial conditions. It's a transformation into something unprecedented in human history. Earth's climate system, freed from human interference, finds a new equilibrium that's more stable and more conducive to biological diversity than anything recorded in human observations. The species recovery stories read like fairy tales of biological resurrection. Passenger pigeons, extinct since 1914, are brought back through genetic engineering projects using DNA preserved in museum specimens. The small populations of surviving humans include scientists who dedicate their lives to these de-extinction projects, viewing them as moral obligations to repair the damage done by their ancestors. American chestnuts, functionally extinct due to blight for over a century, recover through a combination of natural selection and careful breeding by forest communities. The chestnuts that survive develop resistance to the blight while maintaining their ecological roles as keystone species in eastern forests. Large mammal populations recover dramatically. Bison herds on the Great Plains number in the millions, their grazing patterns reshaping grassland ecosystems across the continent. Wolf populations recover throughout their historical ranges, with pack territories extending across landscapes without the barriers of highways and development. Elena's documentation of these changes becomes part of a new scientific tradition. Biology focused on abundance rather than scarcity, ecology focused on recovery rather than conservation, environmental science focused on possibility rather than limitation. The questions scientists ask change fundamentally when they're studying healthy ecosystems instead of damaged ones. But the Century of Wild recovery isn't just an environmental story, it's a human story too. The small populations of humans who witness these changes develop new relationships with the natural world. They understand themselves as participants in recovery rather than managers of decline. They see their role as supporting natural processes rather than controlling them. Children born into this recovered world grow up with a sense of abundance that their great-great-grandparents could never have imagined. They assume that rivers run clean, that forests are vast and diverse, that wildlife is abundant and fearless. They develop what their ancestors would have recognized as indigenous relationships with the land, the deep knowledge of local ecosystems, spiritual connections to natural processes, practical skills for living within natural limits. This isn't a return to pre-agricultural life, but something entirely new. Human communities with modern scientific knowledge, living within recovered natural systems. They have the benefit of understanding ecology, evolution, and environmental science in ways that no pre-industrial society ever could, but they apply this knowledge to supporting natural processes rather than overriding them. The Century of the Wild sets the stage for something unprecedented in human history, the emergence of a truly sustainable civilization. Not sustainable in the sense of slightly reducing environmental impact, but sustainable in the sense of enhancing ecological health while meeting human needs. This is the foundation from which the future will be built. And that future, the lessons learned from this century of recovery, the wisdom gained from witnessing Earth heal itself. That's what we'll explore in our final chapter, because the story of what happened after the vanishing isn't just about loss and recovery, it's about the possibility of choosing a different path forward. In the year 2125, Sarah Chen's great-great-granddaughter stands where San Francisco once touched the sky. Her name is also Sarah Vasquez Chen Miller, carrying the names of all the families that merged and adapted and survived over the past century. She's 23 years old, a master blacksmith like her ancestor, but also something that the original Sarah Chen could never have imagined, a pilgrimage guide, leading young people from settlements across the Pacific coast to witness the ruins of the old world. Today, she's brought 17 young adults to the place their great-great-grandparents called the Golden Gate Bridge. The masterwork of human engineering still stands, but it's transformed beyond recognition. The international orange paint has long since weathered away, replaced by the natural green patina of oxidized steel. The cables, once taut symbols of human precision, now sag under the weight of massive cormorant nests. Entire colonies of seabirds have made the bridge their home, their white droppings creating abstract patterns across the rusted metal. But the bridge stands. After a century of neglect, of storms and earthquakes and salt spray, it endures, not as a monument to human achievement, but as something more complex and valuable, a monument to human excess that teaches profound lessons about what civilization should and shouldn't become. Sarah leads her group across the bridge deck, now thick with soil deposited by wind and time, supporting grasses and wildflowers that bloom in the shadow of rusted steel. Each step echoes hollowly, reminding the pilgrims that they're walking on infrastructure built for a world of automobiles and constant motion, now serving as a pathway between recovered ecosystems. "Tell me what you see," Sarah asks her group. The same question her great-great-grandmother was trained to ask when teaching blacksmithing. But this lesson isn't about shaping metal. It's about shaping the future. The responses come thoughtfully, the way young people speak when they've been raised to think before talking. "I see something beautiful that was built for the wrong reasons," says Marcus, whose community specializes in sustainable architecture. "I see incredible skill used to solve problems that didn't need to exist," adds Elena, a student of ecological design. But it's young David, barely 18 and still learning his place in the world. who captures the deeper truth. I see a bridge that was supposed to connect places, but it was really part of a system that disconnected people from everything that mattered. Sarah nods approvingly. This is why they make these pilgrimages, why every young person in their society spends time studying the ruins of the old world, not to worship the achievements of their ancestors, but to understand the mistakes that led to the vanishing, to learn lessons that were purchased with 4 billion lives. The lessons are carved into stone monuments at every major settlement, wisdom written in granite to ensure it's never forgotten. The first law, complexity is fragility. Every system dependent on another system will eventually fail. The more interconnected and complicated your civilization becomes, the more vulnerable it is to cascade failures that can bring down everything at once. The pilgrims study this principle in the ruins around them. San Francisco had been a marvel of interconnected systems, electrical grids depending on distant power plants, water supplies requiring pumping stations hundreds of miles away, food distribution networks spanning continents. When half the operators vanished, the entire system collapsed within days. The complexity that had been a source of pride became the cause of catastrophic failure. The second law: true wealth is knowledge paired with resources. Either alone leads to catastrophe. The old world had accumulated vast amounts of abstract knowledge but lost the practical skills needed to apply it without complex support systems. Meanwhile, they had depleted the natural resources that could have sustained them if they had known how to use them wisely. Sarah points toward the ruins of downtown San Francisco, where Forrest has reclaimed the financial district. They knew how to move billions of dollars with the touch of a button, she explains, but they didn't know how to preserve food without refrigeration, how to heat their homes without fossil fuels, how to live within the carrying capacity of their environment. When the complex systems failed, all that abstract wealth became worthless. The third law is the most profound. Human happiness requires meaning, not comfort. This lesson was learned not from studying the ruins, but from living in the recovering world. The survivors discovered that people could be deeply satisfied with far less material comfort if their lives had clear purpose, strong community connections, and meaningful work. The young pilgrims understand this intuitively. They've grown up in communities where every person's contribution matters directly to everyone else's well-being, where work produces tangible results, where success is measured by the health of their ecosystem and the strength of their relationships. They can't imagine the existential emptiness that plagued so many people in the old world, despite unprecedented material abundance. But Sarah doesn't want them to feel superior to their ancestors. They weren't evil or stupid, she reminds the group as they continue across the bridge. They were trapped in a system that grew beyond anyone's ability to understand or control. They created a civilization that demanded constant growth, constant acceleration, constant consumption, not because they wanted to destroy the world, but because they didn't know how to create a stable system that could maintain itself. The pilgrims spend 3 days in the ruins of San Francisco, studying different aspects of the collapse and recovery. They examine the flooded subway tunnels, now home to thriving aquatic ecosystems. They explore the overgrown remains of data centers, where forests have grown through server farms that once housed humanity's digital memories. They visit the ruins of the financial district, where the headquarters of global corporations have become nesting sites for endangered birds. Each site teaches specific lessons about sustainability, resilience, and the relationship between human communities and natural systems. But the overall message is consistent. The survivors aren't trying to rebuild the old world. They've created something entirely different. This new civilization measures success not in growth but in sustainability, not in consumption but in creativity, not in domination of nature but in integration with natural systems. It's not a return to the past but a leap toward a future that incorporates the best insights from both traditional wisdom and modern science. Technology hasn't been abandoned, it's been reimagined. Windmills turn throughout the coastal settlements, but they're designed to last for centuries with minimal maintenance rather than to maximize short-term efficiency. Water wheels grind grain, and power workshops, using principles understood for thousands of years but optimized with modern engineering knowledge. Solar forges smelt recycled metals from the ruins, creating tools and art from the detritus of the old world. It's not the Stone Age, it's what the communities call the Balanced Age. Humanity in harmony with Earth's carrying capacity, using technology to enhance life rather than to overcome natural limits. Young Sarah leads her group to the center of the bridge, where the morning fog is beginning to lift, revealing the transformed bay. Where Oakland once sprawled across the eastern hills, now forests cascade down to wetlands of that teem with wildlife. Where countless cars once crossed the bay on multiple bridges, now whales surface in waters cleaner than they've been in centuries. She places her hand on one of the bridge's rusted beams, feeling the texture of metal slowly returning to the earth, and speaks the words that every child in their society learns before they can walk. Never again so many, never again so much, never again so fast. The creed isn't bitter or angry, it's hopeful. It acknowledges that the old world's collapse wasn't caused by human evil but by human excess. Too many people consuming too many resources too quickly for natural systems to maintain balance. The vanishing was a catastrophe, but it was also a correction that allowed both humanity and nature to find sustainable equilibrium. The pilgrims stand in silence for several minutes, each processing their own understanding of what they've witnessed. Some are thinking about the engineering marvels they've studied, others about the ecological recovery they've observed, still others about the human stories of survival and adaptation. But they're all grappling with the same fundamental question. What if humanity could learn these lessons without losing 4 billion souls? What if the next civilization could find balance without requiring catastrophe? What if wisdom could be gained through understanding rather than through suffering? Sarah breaks the silence with the question that ends every pilgrimage. What will you build when you return home? The answers come slowly, thoughtfully. Marcus talks about designing community buildings that enhance rather than disrupt local ecosystems. Elena describes plans for agricultural systems that increase biodiversity while providing food security. David, still young and uncertain, simply says he wants to learn more, to understand enough to make wise choices. These are the conversations that shape the future, not grand plans for conquering new frontiers or dominating new markets, but careful considerations of how to live well within natural limits, how to create beauty without causing destruction, how to meet human needs without compromising the needs of other species. The final revelation of the pilgrimage is both humbling and inspiring. Earth needed just 1 century to erase 10,000 years of human impact. The scars remain: radioactive zones around failed nuclear plants, chemical deserts where industrial accidents poisoned the soil, species driven to extinction that will never return. But life adapted and overcame. Nature demonstrated its incredible resilience when given the chance to recover. Humanity's greatest works crumbled, but humanity itself endured. The lesson isn't that human civilization was worthless, but that it was unsustainable. The species that created art and music and literature, that developed science and medicine and engineering, that built societies capable of compassion and justice, that species survived and learned and grew wiser. As the pilgrims prepare to leave the bridge and return to their communities, Sarah shares one final observation. Our ancestors thought that progress meant doing more, moving faster, getting bigger. But maybe real progress means doing better, living wiser, lasting longer. Maybe the greatest achievement isn't building something that dominates the landscape, but building something that enhances it. The group begins their journey home, but the bridge remains. It will stand for centuries more, slowly weathering back to the iron ore from which it came, providing habitat for generations of seabirds, serving as a crossing point for pilgrims who come to remember and learn. It's become exactly what the best human creations should be: beautiful, functional, and ultimately harmonious with the natural world that sustains all life. The question echoes across the empty bay, carried by wind and whale song. What if we could learn these lessons without losing 4 billion souls? It's a question for the future, for the children being born into a recovered world, for civilizations yet to come. Because the story of the vanishing isn't just about what humanity lost, it's about what humanity found on the other side of catastrophe: wisdom, balance, and the possibility of a different kind of progress. The ruins teach their lessons to anyone willing to listen, and the lessons are clear. Another world is possible if we're brave enough to build it. The fog lifts completely as the pilgrims disappear into the recovered forests of the Coast Range, leaving the bridge to its work of teaching patience, humility, and hope to anyone who comes seeking wisdom from tomorrow's ruins.